everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Between Friends, Conversations with Maitri. I'm your host, Maina Merotra, and in this episode, we will explore the effects of education and economic independence, as well as the delicate balance between Orthodox Islam and modern freedoms. This includes discussions about dressing, interactions, and travel for Muslim girls and women. We'll also explore the impact of isolation on mental health and the challenges faced by those straddling dual cultures. Additionally, we will uncover the multidimensional realities of women's lives within traditional Muslim societies. Today, we have Maitri's donor engagement manager, Fahria Khan, and the acclaimed author of Stay Daughter, Yasmin Azad. The novel weaves together the vibrant tapestry of Yasmin's life as a young Muslim girl in 50s and 60s Sri Lanka. Her memoir dives into the challenges of reconciling Islamic orthodoxy with modernity in a close-knit conservative society. Raised amidst diverse faiths, Yasmin's life story unfolds within the context of a colonial fortress, embodying unity in diversity. So buckle up as we embark on an enlightening journey through the conversation with Yasmin about fusion of identities, the transformation of cultures, and the need for understanding and belonging.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fahria Khan, and I'm so excited to be here with Yasmin Azad today, who wrote the book Stay Daughter. And Yasmin, I just have to say that, first of all, thank you so much for your time today. I'm super excited to be talking to you. And I read your book. It's absolutely amazing. I felt like I was completely immersed with the sights and the sounds and even the tastes of everything you experienced as you were growing up. So thank you again for coming today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and it makes me very happy to hear that you read the book.
And I am from Bangladesh. I grew up in the States, but I'm from Bangladesh, and I know, you grew up in Sri Lanka, what is now known as Sri Lanka now. And a lot of the experiences you had resonated so much with me. There was one part in the book where you talked about how in your culture that the women do not call their husbands by their name, and you say him or so-and-so's baba or so-and-so's dad. And it's interesting because it's the same in Bangladeshi culture as well. And even though I grew up in the States, I was taught that I couldn't say my husband's name. And I think just a couple of years ago, I actually said his name out loud in front of my kids. And all of them just turned to me like, oh my goodness, what is happening? Their whole just outlook on what what our relationship was kind of just was shattered for a little bit, and it was just a really funny moment. So can you talk a little bit about how that has also shaped your life, about how the things that you grew up with in terms of relationships and how that's evolved?
So for me, did you want me to first speak about my experience in Sri Lanka or as an immigrant to the United States?
Both. So maybe you can start out with like your experience in Sri Lanka growing up with kind of those traditional roles. Yeah.
Right. So unlike Bangladesh, which is a majority Muslim country, Sri Lanka is a majority Buddhist country and very multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And so we are only about 9% of the population. So because of that, especially Muslims who live in urban areas, even in my grandfather's time, even as far back as my great-grandfather, they had a lot of interactions with non-Muslims, especially with Christians, who were like the descendants of those who had colonized Sri Lanka, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and then the latest was the British. And what I found even when I was growing up is that even, that I was like straddling two cultures, because I went to a Christian school. I went to Sacred Heart Convent. My friends were both Muslim. I had Muslim friends, my relatives, and Christian friends. And for me, it was always like I had one foot in one culture and another foot in another culture. And I was trying to sort of, like when I am with my Christian friends, I have to leave certain things behind because, they have their customs, and you do as the Romans do, right? That's, you just, and then when I'm with my relatives, I leave the other part behind, like, all the dancing or whatever we did as children that didn't sell. And ironically, when I came to the United States, I've been here about 40 years. In some ways, I think we do that too as immigrants. When we go to work at the workplace, we leave our culture behind, most of it, right? For instance, I'll give you a small example. At my workplace, how in Eastern cultures, you never eat alone. Like if you have food with you and somebody is sitting nearby, you offer them some food at least, right? I grew up never, you don't open a packet of chips and then just start eating it by yourself.
Right.
But that's not done here. I mean, I'm just giving you this small, there's a range of different behaviors. And I quickly learned, no, that's not how it is done. Nobody wants me to offer my pack of chips to everybody else. Or even when I went to graduate school here, we always spoke to our teachers as sir. We didn't, I had co-students who addressed their teachers by their first names. Hello, Bob. Hello, Jim.
Yeah, no, that's
So
very
those
true.
were adjustments I had made. But I think right. But the real challenge came when I raised my 3 children in the United States. Now, that's a whole different issue. So if my child wants to call her neighbor our neighbor by, 50 years older by her name, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. I teach them to say Mrs. Jones, you need to respect your elders. So on the one hand, there's that thing like, you want what you think is good about your culture, the best in your culture. But the other thing is you don't want them to feel so not part of this culture because that's the one they're growing up in. So if all the neighborhood children are saying, hello, Mary, and my son is saying, hello, Mrs. Jones, what does that do for him? So, that's again, there are no small things, right? Even the small things are reflective of the bigger issues. And, so if my mother comes to visit, I don't think twice, right? One of my sons has to give up their bed. I'm not going to put my mother on and we don't have these privacy issues so much, like where you close a door and say, this is my room and nobody else can come in, So even today, now they're grown, I still feel that, I want them to be comfortable in American culture, but I also want them not to lose what I think is the best of my original culture. So that's straddling.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense to me and that completely resonates with me because growing up, I had that same issue as where, I have like my Bangladeshi culture at home. I have, I act a different way at school. I act a different way at the masjid, and it was hard to balance that. And I feel that, with my own kids, I'm hoping to kind of bridge that gap so that they don't feel it so much. And, they do. I feel that, it's a little bit more smooth transition. And it helps that I grew up here because I can kind of offer that perspective of understanding that it's really tough to balance that out and have kind of these 2 parallel separate lives, so to speak. So yeah, so I feel like, your book just really spoke to me when you talked about how, your interactions with your best friend Penny when you were little growing up and you got to do kind of all of the quote unquote, Western things and, go swimming and ride a bike and read books and, eat at the big table with her grandmother with a fork and knife. And then you have like at home, where you're have to be a little bit more subdued, maybe not seen all the time, or not heard all the time, things like that. But at the same time, your relationship with your family, with your parents, especially your father, I mean, it was such a powerful relationship, and I could see how much, that love came through, both the love you have for him and the love he had for you, and the way that, he let you ride a bike and he let you go to school and he understood that those things were important to you. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship with your father?
I will, and I'm so thankful. Thank you for asking me that question because I'm going to begin with a broader statement. One of the reasons I wrote this book, I have several reasons, is that there is a stereotype, because when you're at a distance from anything, right, you stereotype, you just have one or two stories. And there's a stereotype in the Western world that all men in Islamic family communities and Muslim families are oppressive, that we are all oppressed, that all the women are so oppressed. And that's all it's about. And what I wanted to show is, no, it's not what it's all about. Yes, my father, because he was traditional, he did have certain ideas about what a woman should do or shouldn't do. But across the world, no matter what, there's family love, right? There's the love of a parent for a child. And what I wanted to show is that partly, that we have, in our families, we have a lot of joy and connection and good times and ups and downs. So it's not a stereotypical, all the women are oppressed and all the men are patriarchal oppressors. But I also wanted to show that, very often in families, and I think this is happening in Muslim families as well, I mean, not as well, but in equal amounts, a parent's love for a child can help that parent transcend oppressive attitudes, because they don't want to see the child unhappy. In the end, that love will transcend. And, I was thinking even in the United States, for instance, if you think of gay children, parents who are very orthodox and traditional, if they have a child who is gay, often they will change their opinion. If you have a parent who has very strong racist, if the child marries somebody from another race, that parent is also more likely then to start to see the person, like, say, if it's a white parent whose daughter is marrying an African American, he might, that parent's vision will change through that conduit of love. So that's one of the things, and I'm glad you say that it came out so strongly, because I did want to show, here is a person who, my father didn't have beyond a second grade education. He was very, he was very traditional, because that was his background. He grew up in a rural, not his growing up years was in a village. And so even he was able to come around because he loved his daughter. So, and he changed, he later on, I think he was able to see it differently.
No, that's amazing. And, another reason why your book spoke to me is because I felt like my father was similar. I grew up in a very traditional household, even though I was in the US. But I felt like, my father was very progressive in that he encouraged me to get an education, did not treat me differently. His love for me, allowed him to give me permission to do a lot of things. And so, I'm grateful for that, because it definitely made me who I am today. And I believe that's, you can say the same thing, is that, that love that your father gave to you, helped form who you are. And so, I want to kind of shift the focus a little bit here and talk about, what you do now. I mean, you are a mental health counselor, and specifically, I want to talk about how your upbringing helps you, deal with your patients, or help your patients in the context of culturally responsive counseling.
Thank you. So I've retired recently, so I'm not, yes, but I worked for almost 25 years. And I think, once again, I'm going to begin with a broader sort of statement. So one of the things that I became very much aware of when I was working is how much isolation there is in Western society. That's, it just strikes you, because often when I'm seated across from somebody, one of my clients, I don't ask her or him, but mostly I work with women, is like, where's your family? Where are the people that you grew up with, that can help you in this situation? And very often they had once in a while, they might have one parent or one sister sibling. But if you grow up in more Eastern and more Orthodox communities, there's often a whole extended family and a clan that's supportive or can support you. And that was missing. And that's the other reason that I so I'm veering just a little bit away from your question, Fahira, but I'll come back to it. Another reason that I wrote the book is I think that one of the things that has happened in the world is that as we have become more modern, we have lost a lot of community bonds and family bonds that were there. And I don't know if you know that, if you recall that about 3 months ago, the Surgeon General of the United States sent out an advisory. He called it the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, which he says is as bad for mental health and physical health as like if you were smoking like 15 cigarettes a day, or you were, like you had some, yes. And another sort of a little tidbit that I give you is in 2018, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, she set up a Minister of Loneliness because she called it the sad reality of modern life is loneliness. And if you speak to mental health, people in mental health, you'll get that same thing that especially women, I think, young girls in the United States, if you do, the CDC sent out statistics a few months ago about how depression and suicidal thoughts and all this has come up. So when I was working, this is one of the predominant things that I think that I was sort of grappling with. I have to work with this individual, but if the individual goes back to a place where they're alone and isolated, that's such a challenge, because I have no solution to offer to that. So in some ways, whether I sort of did it, didn't do it overtly, what I kept saying is you must, we must stay connected to people. At least a few people, we have to stay connected. Human beings were not born to live alone. I mean, if you're very religiously inclined and, you have a huge spiritual practice, but that's an exception, you have people here and there. But most people were born to live with at least a few people that they're connected to. So that's what the experience that I had, that I became very aware of this lack of community and connection as modernity, has become more and more modern.
Yeah, and you actually really captured that very well in your book, because you talk about all of these relationships with your different aunts. And I love how you describe that, and it's the same in Bangladeshi culture as well, and probably a lot of other Eastern cultures where you have, specific names for your aunts so that you know which aunt it is, like your mother's side,
Yes.
your father's side, Kala versus
Right.
Mami versus all of that. And how, that connection was also played a big part in how your father led his life in terms of
Yes.
taking care of people and his generosity, and especially his
Yes.
connection with his own sister. And so that really it was just so beautiful to read about that. And you show that kind of like the contrast, what you were just describing of the loneliness versus having this huge extended family to support you and be there for you. Yes, they are also there to criticize you sometimes,
Yeah.
but at the same time they're there when you need them. And
Right.
kind of, this is a really good segue, because you're talking about, I read some of your or listened to some of your other podcasts and interviews, is like what happens when women who grew up in a very traditional Muslim homes, become more empowered, who become more economically independent, and what happens to those families. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your observations.
Yes. So having lived to, an old age, living and multiculturally and all that, so one of the conclusions have come to about life is almost everything has a trade-off.
Right.
There's no movement, there's nothing. For instance, if you think even in the Western world, when women went to work, that's, and I believe in economic independence for every woman, their lives didn't necessarily become easier. Sometimes it became more stressful. But that doesn't mean that you need to go back and say they can't go to work, right? So even in our Muslim communities, I find that, when I go back to Sri Lanka, which I do regularly, that the kinds of family bonds we had when I was growing up the woman in the family is the one who maintains it most of the time, right? Because they are the ones who get together, eat. They don't have the time anymore because they're working. They can't take days for weddings, they have to go back to work. And so that's the trade-off. But so what I want, but that doesn't mean that maybe we can recognize that and not just blindly sort of follow a path in which become more and more individualistic. Maybe we can see that and say, is there a way we can lessen this, where women can be economically independent, they can be educated, but maybe we can also not do it at the expense of family and community. I'm not sure that I have all the answers, but at least if we recognize that as an issue, we can start thinking about it and working towards it.
Absolutely. And this, I actually read a quote very recently, and this also just very spoke to me. So I'm just going to read it really quickly and maybe you can comment on it. There is an entire generation of women who are drowning because they were raised with traditional gender roles while being empowered to be independent. These women still take on the majority of house duties while simultaneously killing it in the workplace. They're tired. And I can say I'm tired, because I have that life, this is exactly my life where, I do both. So can you talk a little bit about, in context of what you just mentioned about, how as we've evolved and women are becoming more empowered, it hasn't gotten easier for us.
Right, it has become stressful. But, I'm also thinking, so I came into social media very late in my life, and mostly because of my book, because that's one way to keep, in touch with people. And one of the things I note, how if you have Facebook, you have, not merely messages from your friends, but you have sponsored messages and other people. And I would say that, so 90% of these aphorisms, these proverbs, advice that I say is telling women to go do things on your own. You be you and let the other. And I'm thinking, I don't, obviously we don't want women to do things they don't want to do. We want independence. We want to be able to think freely. But that push to be hyper individualistic, don't worry, just if you want to do it, just go do it. It's a culture that is telling you that, don't sacrifice anything to maintain your connections. You can't have connections without sacrifice. You simply cannot. And so what I think is, I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but as a culture, we have to recognize that there is a sacrifice that you do make to maintain your connections, and maybe talk about, is that worth it? I think it's worth it. You don't sacrifice yourself entirely, but you do have to give something up. And one of the things you give up sometimes is, I will only do it if I want to do it. Right. And maybe we can have a conversation about that, because, as what you were saying. So it doesn't, I know we can begin from there, like whether it's a man or a woman, that even so a woman's stress might be reduced, even if the people who are living there say, let's help each other, even if we have to give something up to help each other.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a role to be played for the men in society, obviously, because they have to also step up and realize that that it's shared responsibility, and everyone has their role, and it should be a complementary, supportive kind of relationship.
Right. So that goes to the heart of it. Even for men, we say you have to give up something too, whether it's your leisure or whatever. But this idea that you can have connection without giving up anything. That's sometimes the foundation on which I see all these messages, like, just do what you want.
Right, exactly. No, that's so true. So I'm going to talk switch a little bit. You talk a lot about when you're brought back inside. So when a girl reaches puberty, she's brought back inside and she's not allowed to go out, and no one is allowed to see her, and she's definitely never allowed to talk to men or be in front of other men who are not, you know,
Right.
in her immediate family. Can you talk a little bit about that? And you talk about things like covering your hair, and then, you know, once you brought back inside, you have to, you know, be more careful about your
Mhm,
shawl and
mhm,
make sure it covers you,
mhm.
you know, properly and all of that. And then also, well, let's start with that, and then I'll ask the second part of that question.
Yes, so I think that's based on a very sort of a traditional idea about honor.
Mhm.
And when my mother was growing up, and you know, and when I was growing up too, it was almost as that the less seen a woman is, the less time she spends in public, the more valuable she is. Like
Mhm.
the honor is sort of her honor is, what shall I say, degraded if she's seen in public and everybody gets to see her. And I think that, and then when it comes time to get her married, nobody would want to marry her because, she has been, there's nothing rare about her. There's nothing sort of she hasn't been set apart. And I think I think when I was brought in, my mother, if she could have given me some freedom, she said, but she felt like if she did that, then when it came time, because this was the time of arranged marriages, when it came
Right.
time to arrange a marriage for me or for any girl who had been given the question that would come up, oh, she's been seen running around all over the place. Even if they have, not like you had to have a relationship or anything. I see her running, walking the road in broad daylight. We don't want her for a bride.
Right.
That's the, what shall I say, the thing that most parents in my generation, even now, are afraid of. We don't want her to be a girl who a bridegroom's family doesn't want.
Yeah. So did your mother wear a headscarf? Was she
She
very
wore
traditional?
she wore actually a full hijab, with the lace
Mhm.
when she was growing up. But in
Okay.
the 1950s or so, they all gave it up. They gave it
Okay.
up. Her generation gave it up. But as you know, in the 1980s onward, it has come back even in Sri Lanka. Not across the board, but quite a
Right.
few. Almost everybody wears a hijab. Quite a few people wear the full burqa.
Mhm.
And for me, that was an issue too. I mentioned that in my book too. Why
Right.
did that come back? And now I know that there's a reason, like there's a political reason, the influence of Wahhabism that came from. But there is also, I feel, and this again I sense from talking to to people my age and even older, that there is a sense in Muslim communities, at least in the one that I grew up, that modernity is not working completely as it's not paradise, it's not utopia. There's a lot of things happening, and I think there is a fear. And in Sri Lanka, as in Saudi Arabia, and I don't know about Bangladesh, I didn't
Mhm.
look up the statistics on that. The divorce rate has not just increased, it has skyrocketed in
Yes.
Sri Lanka among
Yes.
Muslims.
Yes.
So when the divorce rate skyrockets like that, it's the fundamental unit of society that's being affected, right? The family is falling apart.
Right.
And that's a very, very distressing statistic for anyone, but especially for people. So for me, partly the sort of the going back to become, to the burqa and to the hijab and to very Islamic, is like saying, we need to protect ourselves from just blindly becoming modern and, progressing in that route. Does that make sense?
That does, and I think, like, in your book, you do a good job about kind of showing both sides in terms of, like, not one is better than the other. There are
Mm-hmm.
good parts to both cultures and traditions and societies. And I think, like, personally, I wear hijab, and I made a
Yes.
choice to do so well into my adulthood. So,
Yes.
I think, like, but for my girls, I have 3 daughters. I leave it up to
Mm-hmm.
them. There's no force.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as we are getting more progressive and evolved, we realize that it's a very personal thing as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to something that's kind of forced down upon us. So I wanted to, talk about a little bit more about like how you structured your book. So I really enjoyed that, each chapter was a quote, a verse or a hadith, a verse from the
Mhm,
Quran or a
mhm.
hadith. And, can you talk a little bit about like how you came up with that? Why you did that?
Did having a
Yeah.
quote?
Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm assuming it's very intentional. And so,
Yes, yes.
why you decided to kind of structure. I really enjoyed that. It kind of gave a glimpse into what the chapter is going to be about.
Right.
So,
Well, partly I think because, it's not just my story. It began with my great-grandfather and my grandmother. So I wanted some way in which, so I couldn't really make it like, okay, I was born in Sri Lanka, and then this is, so that I didn't have that kind of what's called a narrative arc, like a thread.
mhm,
And I felt like the reader would need something to sort of ground her or him. This chapter is about this. So,
mhm,
that was my main reasons that, when you like, my first chapter begins, or the prologue is, it's the line from the Quran. It says, "Stay in your homes and do not display yourselves." So I want to say this is the beginning. This is how it began. This is the life that my grandmother and my mother lived. And now from there we are going to be proceeding, because and I was also thinking, I must say, of the non-Muslim, the Western reader too, that without some of that background information that the quotes kind of give you,
mhm.
that they would be lost. Like, so why are they doing this? What is the meaning of this? So
That makes
that
sense.
was the main reason that I did it. Yes.
That makes sense. So, speaking of your mother, really quickly, I mean, a lot of the focus is on your father and your relationship with him,
Yes.
and the reason, he was so excited to have you is because in your culture, once a daughter is born, she
Yes.
stays with her family, with her father, and
Yes.
he, his
Yes.
love for you was so, apparent in everything he did for you. When you went away to university, he supported you, and in the beginning he said, okay, you can do this, but I don't want to have anything to do with it. And then you end the
Right.
book with he comes to visit you. But before that happened, I mean, you briefly touch on your mother's influence here, and perhaps she convinced him, or I don't know if she convinced him. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So in one of the chapters, I tell, my mother was allowed to go to school till about the third or fourth grade, because at that
Right.
time the custom was way before puberty, the
Right.
girls were taken out. And I have a chapter on how she didn't have access to books, so she used to keep the newspaper wrapping that came into the house. When we
Right.
were growing up, flour and sugar and all that was wrapped up in newspaper. She would smooth it out. So I think there was a part of her that really understood, because if she had a choice, she would have at least gone up to school, gone like to the 10th grade, maybe even a 12th grade. And though it came as a surprise, because both my parents thought, oh, they'll just indulge me and let me take the university entrance exams. It doesn't, just let her do that, and then we'll get her married. I think something turned around in her, and she thought that, okay, I didn't have the opportunity to go to school. I'm going to get my daughter to do that. I'm
Yeah.
not going to stand in my daughter's way. I'm going to allow her to do that. So I think it's partly her own, how it's very common, like immigrant parents, even who come from very difficult situations, they say, okay, what I didn't have, I'm going to see my child will have, right? Even an
Right.
immigrant from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka
Right.
who never went to school or university, says, I'm going to see that my child goes there. So I think that was what sort of may have, we didn't really speak to that, because, in traditional families, we
You don't
don't
talk.
really sit down and talk about people's feelings
Right.
and intentions. But I
Yeah.
gathered that from what she did,
Yeah.
that was a
Looking back.
that's a very universal parental impulse, right? My child will have a better life than I did.
No, that's so true. Definitely. So we're gonna be wrapping up. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for
Oh,
hours.
thank you. Yes.
Honestly, there's so much in your book to talk about, but I want to end with what kind of advice would you give to a Muslim girl in Sri Lanka, and maybe not necessarily just Sri Lanka in general, growing up today in terms of, cultural norms versus modernity and how to navigate that?
Right. So the first piece of advice I would give is, get the best education you can, because I think that economic independence is something that every human being should have. Because if you don't have economic independence, you really don't have choice. So, and it doesn't mean you need to go to work. Maybe you don't need to, but if you had to make that decision, you don't have any choice if you don't have, economic independence. So that was, but the other part of it is, I said, even as you do get, become, modern or progressive, don't move away from the good part of your culture, which for me, especially as a mental health worker, that I think, don't give up community and connection, because you will need that all your life.
Right.
So put some effort to maintaining those connections too, and leading a life that fosters those connections. Don't make it all about individualism and independence. Have both if you can.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, not just for Muslim girls, but any girls or boys for that matter, making
Yes.
sure
Oh,
that you
yes.
have the connections. So any other kind of last words you want to talk about? I mean, honestly, like I mentioned, I could talk to you for the rest of the afternoon, but we're limited in our time. So once again, if you have any last thoughts before, we say our goodbyes.
Right. So, all that we've come to, as I said, with all this loneliness, despair, that we may have come to a place where perhaps now we need to turn around back a little bit. I'm hoping that the pendulums of individualism has swung so far to one side that I'm hoping people will recognize that maybe it needs to come back a little bit to community and not just the individualistic person. Yeah.
No, that's so true. I agree with you. Absolutely. I just want to thank you again for your time today. It has been absolutely wonderful speaking with you, and I actually hope I get to meet you in person. I mean, I think you live on the East Coast, and I'm in California, but
I can see the San Francisco Bridge there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So thank you again for your time. Once again, it was amazing talking with Yasmin Azad today about her book, Stay Daughter. So thank you.
Once again, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Yasmin and Fahria, for this great discussion. For a deeper understanding of Yasmin's story, be sure to pick up a copy of Stay Daughter. Listeners, make sure to share this episode with your networks and continue listening to the Maitri Podcast. Please email us your thoughts at maitri@maitri.org and visit the Maitri website, www.maitri.org, for more information about our services. Thank you for listening.
This show is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney for legal advice. Views expressed by guests of the radio show are individual opinions and not endorsed by Maitri.
This project was made possible by funding provided by Santa Clara County Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention.